Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
September 30th is the annual day of honoring and remembrance of those who fell victim of religious authority, like residential schools. Residential schools were set up all over the US and Canada. These schools were administered by the church, and their objective was to indoctrinate children into Euro-Christian ways. In Canada, day in residential schools were made mandatory for kids between the ages 7 and 15 in 1884. Parents could no longer choose between sending their child to school or keeping them at home, or else they would be fined or even imprisoned. Kids would usually stay in these schools for months to even years. In the US, many parents sent their children to these schools because Native children were not allowed to attend public schools with white people, and the only form of education that they had was these schools. Soon though, in 1991, the US passed a law that made it mandatory for kids to attend these schools, or else they would also face the consequences, like in Canada, that they would either be faced to prison or fines. Carlisle Indian Industrial School is actually the first residential school to open, and it opened its doors first in 1879. This school was actually federally funded, and its philosophy was kill the Indian, save the man. The main goal of this school was to assimilate children by forcing them to stop practicing their culture and forbidding them to speak their native language. Carlisle became the blueprint for over 300 of similar schools like this. Not too long after, it also became the blueprint for Canada. In 1879, Canada sent over a lawyer to the US by the name of Nicholas Flood Davis, and he visited many schools, one being Carlisle. Once returning to Canada, he recommended the government to set up their own residential school system as soon as possible.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
Kids in these schools had their hair cut short, forced to wear uniforms, and were given numbers instead of names sometimes. And if not, their native name would be stripped away and they would be given a more acceptable name. And most of the time they endured physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. And all at the hands of the people they were supposed to trust, their teachers. A young native girl, Shitala Shah, was actually 8 years old when the churches came over. She was lured from the South Dakota Yankton Reservation with promises of hope, adventure, and education. In 1884, she willingly left to Wabash, Indiana to attend a residential school. Teachers took her traditional clothing, and upon arrival, she noticed that they wanted to cut everyone's hair. So she snuck away and hid. But sadly, the adults found her hiding space. The adults dragged her as she was screaming and pulled her into another room and strapped her onto a chair. I'm gonna look down real quick to read the quote just because I don't want to misquote it. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. That's what she wrote in her memoir, American Indian Stories. Sadly, Shitala Shah would go on to live most of her childhood in these residential schools. She's one of the hundreds and thousands of kids that attended these schools in the US and Canada. Boys and girls were kept separate, and siblings rarely even interacted.
At that time, they never told us that our sisters were across the hallway. And I didn't know that for the longest time. Then I spotted my sister, Nora, and I was so glad and so hysteric, and I went running to her and I reached out to her, and just hugged her, and I was just shaking, like, and terrified. And I was wondering why she was pushing me away. I didn't realize that we weren't supposed to know that we both lived in the same place, and we weren't allowed to speak to each other. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long, webbed strap. He was setting an example that, if you do this is what's going to happen to you. And all the other boys were watching, and the girls were still going through.
A survivor of these residential schools, Chief Bobby Joseph, said that he didn't even know how to interact with girls anymore, and that he never even interacted with his own sister beyond a wave across the dining hall. Children were strictly prohibited to speak their native language, even though that is all they knew. Residential schools didn't have the same teachings as regular schools. Girls were basically taught home ed, like cooking, sewing, and stuff like that. Boys were taught things like carpentry and farming. Many of the kids only went to class part-time, and the rest of the time they would be performing child labor. The work was involuntary and unpaid. It was excused as practical training for the kids, but in all reality, these schools would not be able to run without it. Kids had so little time in class that by the age of 18, they were barely at 5th grade level. Survivors recall being beaten and strapped. Other kids recall being strapped to their beds. Others recall kids having needles shoved in their tongue for speaking their native language.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
Unsanitary conditions and overcrowding fueled diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza. Kids who were weakened by trauma and meager rations were the ones who were most affected. Children died so much that schools had their own cemeteries in them, and most of the time kids were the ones building the coffins.
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter is dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Others died of suicide, or they would simply run away. This happened so much that bounties were set up for runaways. Scholars estimate that about 40,000 children have died at the residential schools, with 140 being in Canada and 408 being in the US. 4 residential schools currently remain open, which are the Kemawa, Sherman, Riverside, and Floundry residential schools. Because of things like this and many other reasons are why we should stand up for Natives. Because Native families are still struggling with their children being unjustly taken away. So please spread the word and uplift Native voices. And remember, every child matters. Goodbye.